This morning, I did a session with year 8 students from Ivanhoe Girls Grammar School, and the students were studying this book, Vulture's Gate. And it was so amazing to talk to them about it because I wrote this book before they were born. I wrote it in the mid-noughties and it was published by Ellen and Unwin in 2009. And it was kind of incredible to be discussing the book with 13 and 14-year-old students living now and thinking about what the apocalypse, what a dystopia might look like, all those sort of questions that come out of reading dystopian fiction. And what surprised me the most is I thought this year that nobody would want to read about a dystopia in the middle of a pandemic, that this would be the least likely book of mine to be taken from the shelves. This was my 9th novel. I've published 11 all up, as well as 23 various types of books. But Vulture's Gate was a very different sort of book for me to write. Before it was published, I'd mostly written historical fiction and contemporary realist fiction. And writing Vulture's Gate really forced me to go into dark places and think about worst case scenarios and big ideas that I wanted to communicate through story. It mostly grew out of the events of 2001 when the two towers fell in New York in September 2001. I think it triggered a reaction in writers around the world about thinking about worst case scenarios, thinking about how the ground beneath our feet was shifting, how culture was changing. And it particularly triggered a lot of young adult dystopian fiction. And Vulture's Gate was one of those books that was, in a way, the seeds of it were sown when the towers fell. It also connected to ideas about gender, because the more books I write, the more I've become aware of an imbalance in how we tell stories and how we tell the hero story. And despite the fact that most readers are actually women, that most heroes are men. And of course, that's been shifting and changing across the last few generations. But it's still true. And they're one of the most startling statistics I came across when I was playing with the ideas for Vulture's Gate was the gender imbalance in the world. That there, Amrita Sen wrote an article in the late 90s talking about the 100 million missing girls. It was such a startling statistic that there, back then, it's now, I believe the latest stat on it is 170 million missing girls. But this gender imbalance across the planet that we so rarely discuss will have lasting repercussions for all the young people alive today. And it, as a statistic, as a moral and political dilemma, it fed into the writing of Vulture's Gate. So the students that I was chatting with this morning, they had so many excellent questions. It's so invigorating to talk to young people about their ideas, about the world, about the future. They ask questions about religion, about science, about character. And I was so excited by it. So often when you write a book, you think it has a brief moment in the world. But what this morning really illustrated is that a book can have a life beyond its year of release. Sadly, a lot of Australian books don't have longevity. They do leave bookshops and aren't found again. So I feel very privileged to write for an audience that are constantly exploring texts in quite deep ways, and grateful to the teachers that bring the books to my readers. So the year 8 English teacher who'd given it to her class as a class text also had really interesting questions to ask about it. And I'm just going to read the first opening chapter of Vulture's Gate, first opening paragraph, give you a sense of the flow of the prose. I tried to keep it punchy. I hope it's as punchy as I remember it. Callum felt the rumble of road trains and froze. Black shadows skidded across the blinds as a convoy pulled up outside. Outstationers. If only he hadn't insisted on staying home alone. Instinctively, he dived for the floor. The red neon sign at the gates of the compound flashed a warning across the surrounding desert, but Callum knew his father's was still miles away. Inside, the Elvis Presley cuckoo man jumped out of his clock and crooned the hour. Fighting down his fear, Callum crawled across the black and white tiled floor towards the kitchen, heading for the safety of the security apartment. Beneath him, the ground trembled. Above, the ceiling buckled, and Callum covered his ears to block out the sound of Molotov cocktails exploding against the compound roof. One by one, every alarm in the refuge was triggered, screeching against the invasion. I like to think that it's an action-packed book, but it's more than a story full of explosions, motorbikes, and road trains. It's a story about survival, and it's a story about how we relate to each other. The great thing about discussing the book with those Year 8 students this morning was remembering and reminding myself that at the heart of a story is a great character, and that fiction works in the same way that a parable works, in that if you can't connect it to human experience, then all those ideas and all those statistics and all those fears and all that rationale doesn't mean anything unless it's connected to the experience of real people. So, hey, thanks Year 8 for studying it. And thanks Ivanhoe Girls Grammar for inviting me to discuss it with the students. And yeah, I'd like to think that the book will go on finding readers who maybe aren't born yet, just as those students this morning weren't born when I first penned those opening paragraphs of Vulture's Gate.